Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm going to be taking a look at Sif's new uniform to see what kind of value she brings to your roster. Since this review is a little bit late, I'm going to be doing a comparison between her and Valkyrie to give you an idea of how you might want to build each one, since they're very similar to one another. And to make the video even more interesting, I also included the testing that I did for all three characters that came with this mid-month, so that's Sif, Heimdall, and Hela in Alliance Conquest. Similar to my other two videos for this mid-month, my updated card stats now have 22% Pierce on them, so keep that in mind when you see this testing. Some of the highlights for Sif's new uniform is that she gets guaranteed crit rate on her tier 2 passive. Her third skill now gives her invincible and damage accumulation for damage dealt. And her fifth skill now gets paralysis, which is good for ABX. She also gets that all defense down that ignores immunity up to 60%, as well as a nice 25% heal, and that frenzy buff that gives up to 50% all attack and 30% crit for a total of 7 seconds with a 16-second cooldown. For her tier 1 passive, she gets penetration to all sources up to 30%, which means that you generally don't want to run a CTP of destruction for her because that penetration will clash with this tier 1 passive, and the CTP of destruction will effectively work like a regular obelisk. She also gets super armor here, which is really nice for not getting interrupted in PvE, where you generally don't have guard break immunity on things like the CTP of energy or the CTP of rage. Her leadership is much more desirable now since you get to boost your own attack in things like World Boss Ultimate and World Boss Legend, as well as boost your survival a little bit in things like Alliance Conquest. Although unfortunately this only applies to combat types, so if you're running this leadership in Alliance Conquest, it might be a little bit counterintuitive since you have to use all three combat types, which could potentially be easily countered by the enemy team. Her uniform passive is pretty decent in PvE content, where all the final bosses have the boss type tag, but in PvP it doesn't serve any function since none of the characters have that tag. The design choice is a little strange since the tier 1 passive is predominantly PvP focused, yet the uniform passive is focused primarily in PvE. So looking at her kit alone, it's not really clear what the dev's intended purpose for her is. Looking at her artifact, it makes it a little bit clearer that she has more of a PvE role, but that tier 1 passive having the super armor and the penetration does give her some value in PvP, even if you are running something of a PvE build. Also, her artifact doesn't substantially change her playstyle, so you shouldn't worry too much about getting it. In terms of her hit count, the first skill does 8 hits, the second skill does 9 hits, the third skill does 17 hits and can't be cancelled early, though you can cancel it just to get the accumulation. The fourth skill can be delay cancelled to some extent, but you want to wait till you get that final strike since it goes up to 25 hits. Then the last skill takes the longest to execute, but you definitely don't want to cancel it since it goes up to a total of 56 hits. Similar to Valkyrie, the sixth skill does 46 hits, and you don't want to instant cancel this, but rather delay cancel after the lines appear. The first test that I do is on Thanos stage 60, and this is with an obelisk and no damage proc, and without using the awakening skill, just to see how the uniform performs. If you're looking for a build recommendation for her, for PvE specifically, I would recommend a CTP of Rage, since it synergizes well with that guaranteed crit rate that she gets in her tier 2 passive. And besides that, she doesn't really have skills that can be cancelled quickly on top of one another to layer the damage, so you're basically stuck with executing one skill after another, which can be more effective with a CTP of Rage proc, where you can still have your proc up and go on to multiple skills with that increased damage. In terms of her rotation, the one that I went with is you use the 3 and cancel it instantly going into the 4th skill, and then after you hit the ground and the large strike hits, you go into your 5th skill. If your procs don't line up throughout the fight, you can also leave the 3rd skill to play through since it does decent damage, but you largely want to proc on the end of the 4th skill and into the 5th skill. The 1 and 2 are mostly just going to be filler. So for the first test with no damage proc or awakened skill used, I finished with 1 minute and 42 seconds remaining. Once you have Sif's awakening skill unlocked, the rotation changes in that you do the 3rd skill cancelled immediately into the 6th skill, and then once the lines appear, you delay cancel and go into your 5th skill. Using this rotation and the awakening skill, I finished a full minute and 11 seconds faster than I did without using the awakening skill. From this point on, I'm going to be comparing Sif to Valkyrie, so you can see her stats here and the build that I have for her, as well as the stats and build that I have for Valkyrie shortly after this. I have a CTP of Rage on Valkyrie, and coincidentally I decided to use the same thing on Sif, since she functioned much the same way. I did initially take Sif into Timeline to test her with that penetration passive that she had, so I had an invincible and guard break immunity obelisk, but she didn't really perform as well as I expected her to, so I decided to make her into a PvE build or a PvE centered character and switch up my Valkyrie build depending on how she did relative to her. So after equipping the CTP of Rage, my clear time on stage 60 of Thanos improved by another 37 seconds, going from 2 minutes and 53 seconds remaining to 3 minutes and 30 seconds remaining. Comparatively, for Valkyrie, I finished about 16 seconds slower, but that doesn't really mean too much in fights like Thanos, where the animations and interruptions can really kind of drastically alter the finish time, so she's very close to Sif as it is. To give you a better idea or a comparison of their clear times, I do the first 30 health bars of stage 25 of Knull to see who can clear it faster or how close they are to one another. For Sif, I reached the halfway mark with 3 minutes and 22 seconds remaining, and for Valkyrie, I reached that same halfway mark with 3 minutes and 25 seconds remaining. So it's about 3 seconds faster, but 3 seconds is largely irrelevant in the comparison between the two characters, so they largely function pretty much the same, at least for World Boss Ultimate and World Boss Legend. In ABX though, it might be a little bit of a different matter, since for Sif, I managed to get about 8.1 million with the team that I'm currently running, which is She-Hulk Leadership and Valkyrie Support, as well as Sif's own uniform passive support. The reason that I mentioned that it might be a different matter is because for this particular season that I was testing in, the roar cancel was dependent on the silence effect, and the silence effect is only located on Sif's 6th skill. So what that means is that you have to delay the 6th skill in order to match up with the roar to be able to cancel it, and that leads to you dealing less damage since you miss out on a full activation of the 6th skill throughout the duration of the fight. The reason that that's important is because I scored around 8.2 million or 100,000 more with Valkyrie, and that's due to the fact that her 2nd skill has silence on it, which means that I don't have to delay the 6th skill and I can activate it as soon as it's available. Regardless, the characters seem to score pretty similarly on the Silence season, with Valkyrie possibly having a little bit of an edge, but on the Paralysis and Burn seasons, where Sif doesn't have to wait to activate her 6th skill, she might actually be ahead of Valkyrie. You also have to keep in mind that Sif has a character-specific artifact available to her, whereas Valkyrie does not, and besides that, Valkyrie might be getting an even bigger upgrade with her next uniform, which is likely to arrive with the next Thor movie. But as you can see, both characters are relatively close to one another, as I mentioned, with Sif potentially getting an edge over Valkyrie on 2 seasons of ABX, whereas Valkyrie might have an edge on only 1. Now, although both these characters function similarly in PvE content, in PvP content, Sif does seem to have an edge over Valkyrie, despite the fact that Valkyrie has an iframe ignore counter skill. Valkyrie's skills are a little bit clunky, and she has long animations which are outside of iframes, and besides this, she also summons other characters to the field, which adds more targets for the opponent to be able to activate on, which in turn splashes damage onto her. You can see on this clip that I'm repeating that Sif does seem to do pretty well on a damage proc, especially because she has that guaranteed dodge, the guaranteed crit, and the super armor to keep her from being guard broken and from her taking too much damage all at once. She does end up dying, but she can take out some tanky characters with that damage proc and the penetration from her passive. If you want to use her for PvP content, which you can do, I would recommend something like a CTP of Greed, since she seems to function a lot better with the damage proc, considering that her damage is somewhat lacking due to the long animations if you don't have a damage proc. Because of the super armor that she has, you can also opt for a Transcendence and even a CTP of Authority, since her third skill is damage accumulation for damage done and not damage taken, so it wouldn't clash. In this clip versus Doom, you can see two interesting things. One is that with a damage proc, she has the capability of taking out a Doom with an Authority because of that penetration passive, but also that her Awakening skill is kind of bugged and that she doesn't prioritize using it when it's available. As I mentioned, I would kind of recommend a damage proc on her to take out strong characters quickly before they ramp up and are able to take her out, because her skill animations are a little bit slow. She isn't necessarily going to be super consistent in her performance with it, but she will be able to do some work for you in things like Alliance Conquest, and you can double by using her in things like ABX or World Boss Ultimate, World Boss Legend content as you see fit. You can also see that the Awakening skill has been available now from the beginning of the fight versus Century, and it only really activates when the opponent goes into their iframe and acts like an iframe counter in a sense. I did one more fight here against the same team to show her consistency. I did mention that it might not be very consistent, but it's not as bad as I make it out to be. This fight again shows you that the Awakening skill is bugged and should be activating, since the T3 and Awakening skills are always prioritized over other skills and are immediately activated by all other character AIs when they are available. So hopefully the devs fix this, but despite that fact, the accumulation that she gets from her third skill, as well as the invincible and frenzy buffs that she gets from her fifth skill, in combination with the iframes and burst damage, allows her to wipe out some pretty strong teams. So here is an example in Alliance Conquest. Even though this fight was unfortunately strafed, so the character started at 25% health, she still had that burst damage to take them out quickly. And then you'll see that when the second fight starts, she won't go into her Awakening skill as most other characters do, but she's still able to quickly dispose of those characters, and then when Widow iframes, she goes into her Awakening skill. If you thought that Miles was doing the majority of the work because of his passive giving extra damage to heroes, here is another example where I take on a Jean with some other side characters that don't really matter, but you can see that even when she revives, Sif is still able to take her down with the burst damage that she gets with the CTP of Rage that I have equipped currently on her. This second fight could have ended up being pretty bad without the Awakening skill instantly activating, especially with my really low health, but thankfully I was able to pull through. Now, Sif isn't really going to do anything too special for you in PvP like Alliance Conquest, but Hela, on the other hand, is definitely meta, since she's able to take down top meta teams that are hero types, like the Defenders, for example. You can see that she can solo the Defenders by herself, even without the use of a debuff and a second support. Since I screwed up, I wanted to put in Victorious, but I accidentally put in Dr. Voodoo, yet I still ended up winning. Another meta team that she's good against in Alliance Conquest is the Eternals, specifically because they're hero types and her uniform passive gives her reduced damage from them and increased damage to them. As a result of that and other supports or her own leadership, her third skill can essentially one-shot even without the need of a damage proc, and if you have her artifact and are able to take down the opponent's Cersei very quickly, You can wipe out the whole team, since Circe's awakening skill will likely trigger your artifact, which will then in turn allow you to survive and take out the rest of the team and her second life. Here is another clip of me fighting the Eternals, but this time I wasn't able to take down Circe very quickly. I was able to take down the other opponents, but she triggered my artifact before I took her first life, which in turn, after I killed her, her second life was able to take me out, since my artifact invulnerability or immune to death was already activated. Regardless, I was still able to wipe out a full team with one meta character. If you're wondering what kind of teams to run Hela with, usually you're going to use her on a team that the opponent will likely have to use a support to take down. So that's probably going to be villain type characters like probably Mephisto or things like Doom. It's very likely, and I wouldn't be surprised, that the go-to team for walling or being very difficult to take down in Alliance Conquest will be something like Doom, Wolverine, and Hela support. Since Wolverine and Hela can both have that unkillable artifact activate, it should make the team pretty tricky to take down, since they can live for at minimum 4 seconds of the fight with a level 3 artifact, I believe, and up to 7 seconds of the fight with a maxed out level 6 artifact. Surprisingly to many people, Heimdall is actually meta in Alliance Conquest, and you'll see why in the clips that I show. Of the many reasons why Heimdall is a meta character, one of them is that he can solo other meta characters by himself. Another is that due to his uniform passive that gives him that amazing debuff, you can run him with his own leadership or any other kind of leadership that you want that isn't a debuff itself. So you can potentially run Heimdall with 2 supports and make him either really tanky or make him deal a lot of burst damage with 2 offensive supports, or you can get a mix of both. And if you run a CTP of Destruction like I have, you'll be able to take down top metas very quickly before they're able to get going and do any real damage to you. In those first 2 clips alone, you saw that I was able to solo a Hulk, a Sentry, a Hela, and even a Shang-Chi with his Reflect. For consistency, I fight another Shang-Chi with a support and Jean leadership, but the outcome is still the same. In this next fight, I take on a Sentry with 2 supports, being Blue Marvel and Hela, but because I have a proc build, I'm able to take those 2 characters down fairly quickly, as well as Sentry, and after he revives, I'm able to survive because Heimdall often spams his 4th skill, which has that invulnerability bubble up for a long period of time. I wanted to see if Heimdall could survive 2 revive characters in this one, being Sentry and Mephisto, and I was capable of doing that, but you might have noticed in the previous clips that in almost all of them, my artifact activates. Ironically, in this one it doesn't, but in order for him to be considered meta, I would say that you definitely need that artifact, especially versus revive characters. And if those teams that I took down weren't enough to convince you that he is meta, here is me versus a double support Doom, which I did end up beating. The reason that I was able to win against him was because of his amazing 4th skill, which gives me that constant invulnerability or immunity bubble, and because of the artifact allowing me to heal back up when Doom has used his skills. And if the fight goes on long enough, he'll immediately go into his awakening skill, which if you have a destruction build like me, the penetration and the iframe ignore from it will essentially guarantee that he wipes out the enemy team. So as a quick summary, as standalone characters, if you're wondering between Sif and Valkyrie, Sif does have a little bit more value in PvP and might score a little bit better in ABX, and is almost equivalent to Valkyrie in PvE content like World Boss Ultimate and World Boss Legend. As supports though, Valkyrie's support might end up being a little bit better, and because it applies to all enemies, not just bosses, you'll likely want to use her in PvE content like Dispatch as a support, and because those effects also work in PvP, you might want to use her as a support there too. As a result of this, I went with a damage proc for Sif, and for Valkyrie, I put on an insight for her. Besides the comparison between Valkyrie and Sif, Hela is one character that you definitely want for Alliance Conquest and probably for Timeline depending on the ban list for the week. And if you play a lot of Alliance Conquest, Heimdall is definitely a character that you don't want to sleep on because he does a lot of work and is very strong by himself. Anyways, that's the Asgard Invasion patch. I was really happy with the updates to all three characters, Heimdall, Sif, and Hela. And I'm hoping that we get some other upgrades in the future for Asgard-related characters, possibly for characters like Malekith and the Warriors 3. For the next video, I'm going to be looking at Thanos changes and the significance they have to her value in PvE and possibly PvP. But yeah, anyways, if you liked the video or found it interesting or useful, please consider liking or subscribing, and if you've already done that, please consider sharing it with your friends since they might find it useful as well. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comments section down below, or possibly consider joining the Discord. Thanks for your time and watching, but the video is now over.